Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to continue our series looking at knight versus bishop endings. And last time, when we started on the series, we took a look at three endings. In the first one, the bishop came on top, and the next two, it was the knight that triumphed, although in both cases, it could have gone either way in certain respects. So, I mean, the bishop wasn't much worse necessarily, and there were positions where the bishop could actually be pretty good, but the knight still came out ahead. This time we're going to take a look at a game where, again, the knight kind of saves the day here. Well, actually, not again. Last time the knight's won. This time it's the knight rescuing me rather than providing a full victory, a full point. But the bishop, I think, with best play in this game, could have won. So we'll take a look at some of these finer points in a few minutes. I just wanted to note kind of a strange point about at least my own games, which is that most of the time in my games, when a knight versus bishop situation has arisen, two things have occurred. One is that I've usually had the knight, and the second is that I've usually done better. I've often won. So whether this is because of my opening repertoire or just something about my style, or maybe that most of my opponents, though not myself, though not I, tend to overestimate the value of a bishop, and so they maybe more readily go into what is in fact a poor ending because they think that having the bishop against the knight is going to be more favorable than it in fact is. So whatever the reason, at least if going through my games, it looks like there's much more high quality, or at least medium quality. I don't want to get carried away here, but whatever quality material there is, more of it is in favor of the knight than the bishop, and so that's the case in our example today as well. All right, now this is played in the 2000 Amateur Team Championship, the Eastern Division, and it was a very poor tournament for me, but this is at least one of the highlights of that event for me. Okay, so I'm white, Alexander Alexienko is black, and the opening was a gambit line where I didn't succeed in maintaining adequate compensation for the pawn that I sacrificed. And so when we got to this position here, as you can see, I'm white, and I'm just down a pawn, more or less for nothing. So we've got rook and knight versus rook and bishop. The most important feature of this position, I would say, is that black's queen, well, in addition to the extra pawn, is that black has this nice, clean 3-on-1 majority on the queen side. So I've got a 3-on-2 on the king side, 3-on-2 pawn majority on the king side, but it's going to take me some time to create a passed pawn. The fact that black's pawns are split over there is not really a detriment because they all serve the function of holding up my majority. So and the e6 pawn and the h6 pawn, neither of them is really susceptible to the sort of attack that could lead to that pawn's loss. So black is basically up a pawn for nothing here. Now, what have I got going for me? Really, I would say maybe two things. One is short-term, one is much more important. The short-term advantage is that black's rook is maybe slightly out of play, and it'll take him a little while to get it into the game. As we'll see, black has no real problems taking care of that problem. The other advantage that I've got, and this is more significant and really represents my main, or part of, let's say, the heart of my drawing hopes, is that I can achieve a pretty high degree of control over the light squares. So you can see, of course, he's got a dark squared bishop, and he's got no pawns that can control, for example, well, no pawn that can control e4. Put that in red. c4 he can control with b5, but b5 is kind of hard for him to achieve in many cases. And just generally speaking, I can kind of camp out on a lot of light squares where it's difficult for him to bother me. So that's really my main trump, is the possibility of controlling the light squares and hopefully creating some kind of fortress that he won't be able to break through. All right, well, let's take a look at the game now. I played king g2, king e7, and I played knight e3, and actually offered a draw. Now, it's a slightly inappropriate draw offer. I think I've mentioned the idea of the slightly inappropriate draw offer before. Here was kind of a twofold bluff. One is just hoping that my opponent would have a little bit of fear of my rating. Sometimes that works. In this case, it didn't. The other point was just a tactical one. I was hoping that my opponent would be taken aback by this double attack I have. So, of course, there's a threat on the rook, but then there's also the threat of rook c1, and when the bishop moves, to play rook takes c7 with check. Now, of course, the threat to the rook is something that's real, but the other threat isn't, and my opponent rightly rejected the draw, simply played rook to g8. And the point is that if I play rook to c1, it just loses, because bishop to d2, rook c7 check, and now, of course, not king to d8, which would be terrible. I play rook to takes a7, regaining the pawn and saving my knight on account of the skewer on the back rank. But instead of king to d8, of course, black just plays king to d6, and now with this double attack hitting the rook and hitting the knight, I'm simply lost. Naturally, then I didn't play rook to c1. It was just the bluffed threat of rook to c1 that I hoped would have its effect. So I played king to f3, and now I really am threatening rook to c1. My opponent played c5, and here I played an interesting move, and I think maybe a provocative move, rook to d1. The reason why it's provocative is that I'm inviting black to not exactly force, but practically speaking, force a trade of rooks with rook to d8. And since I'm down material, I'm down a pawn, exchanging pieces is not, generally speaking, in my best interest. That most of the time is entirely to the advantage of the side that's got the extra material. Because with fewer pieces on the board, it's harder for me to create more threats. And ultimately, if you're down a pawn in a king and pawn ending, when there's more than one pawn on the board, if it's just a normal situation, you're completely lost. Of course, it's not I have no intention of trading off to a pure king and pawn ending here. I want to trade off to a knight versus bishop ending and try my luck there. The second point with this rook to d1 move is that, okay, I can not do that, but if I don't, black is still going to play rook to d8, and then I have to worry about him penetrating. So d2 in particular, but d3, d4 are also possibilities. And I don't really know that I can just afford to let him come gallivanting into the heart of my position and creating whatever threats he wants. So, the rook goes to d2, the bishop goes to d4, and, I've just got problems everywhere. So, yeah, I don't really want to allow the trade of rooks, all things being equal, but it seems like that's about the best that I can do here. So I played rook to d1. Alexienko played h5 first. I played king to e4. And now I think Alexienko's best would have been starting off with first bishop to d4, clogging up the d file here, and also semi-threatening to exchange the knight. And after knight c2 to play bishop to f6. And here, I think black has a couple of ideas. So one is that he'd like to simply get these pawns rolling, b5, b4, c4, and so on. But also maybe he can play h4 and try to get his rook on my side of the board. The point being that if I respond to h4 with rook to g1, well, in that case, black can maybe take on g3 and then swing his rook to d8, and in he comes. While if instead, get rid of all the stuff, if I meet h4 with rook to d3, well, then he takes, I take, and then maybe rook to h8 followed by rook h2 or rook to h1. And once again, I've let the rook in, and then I'm going to have a very, very difficult time mounting a real defense. So I think that would have been a pretty promising way for him to go. But instead he played rook to d8. And, okay, I'm not sure what the ideal result ought to be in this position. But I think my chances are better here, practically speaking, than they would have been on the line that I just mentioned. So with bishop to d4 followed by bishop to f6. Okay, so let's take a look. So rook to d8, and now I trade. I have to, but it's also something that I think I want to do. Okay, king takes d8, and I don't remember exactly where I thought of the idea in the game that I used and ultimately worked, but it might have been before the rook trade or it was around here. But I did make one mistake in the execution of that idea. Okay, so here I played f5. Now, why am I doing this? Well, general rule of thumb here, when you're ahead of material, trade trade, or sorry, when you're ahead of material, you want to trade pieces, but when you're behind material, you want to trade pawns. And the reason for that is that most pawn down endings where there's just one pawn left are drawn. Whether it's king and pawn versus king, rook and pawn versus rook, bishop and pawn versus bishop, knight and pawn versus knight, or let's say even here, bishop and pawn versus knight. I mean, all of these endings with just one pawn left are drawn. In the case of this kind of ending, the reason it's drawn is quite simple. I'll sacrifice my knight for the remaining pawn when that situation arises. So, okay, of course, that's kind of a simple idea. But there's a second reason why I want to swap off some pawns, and it's that, well, actually, there's at least two more reasons why I want to swap off pawns besides this very generic reason. So, one is that if I can get rid of all of his pawns on the king side, then I can devote all of my defensive energies to the queen side, and I've got a defensive idea that I have in mind for that may be able to save the day. Certainly if there are pawns on both sides of the board, or at least if he has pawns on both sides of the board, that's more difficult for me to handle. With his bishop, that gives him the ability to play on both sides of the board. So if he can, if I have a passed G pawn, let's say, and he's trying to basically promote the pawns on the queen side, well, his bishop can do both jobs at once, so it can very easily cover the G5 square or the G7 square while simultaneously protecting a lot of important squares on the queen side. Whereas my knight is going to have a much tougher time. I mean, if I've got to try to hold up all these pawns on the queen side, I'm probably going to need my king and my knight both. But if I have to worry about pawns on the king side too, well, my knight can't handle it. I mean, it's not a long-range piece like the bishop. So that's the second reason why I want to trade off as many pawns as I can, in particular the pawns on the king side. And the third reason is that, hey, if I can make a passed pawn on the king side, then that too might distract him a bit, and maybe that little bit of distraction will be all that I need, will be just the thing I need to be able to erect an impenetrable barrier for his queenside pawns. So we'll see how that works. Okay, now here's kind of a little quick question for you. How should black meet this move f5? So if I'm claiming that what I want to do is swap off pawns, then you might think maybe e5 should be played. Or do we just play e takes f5, check, and get it over with, and then get on with the queenside advance? What do we do? Well, black, I think, made the best move. King e7. So this was a neat little finesse here. I mean, the reason why this is neat and worth mentioning is that we see this pawn tension here with the pawns on f5 and e6, and there's just kind of this automatic thought, all right, well, the pawn's being attacked, and once you reject e5, as you should, if e5, something like f6 and then king f5, or even king d5, I mean, you're just giving up a lot of squares. The bishop on c3 can no longer help fight against the f6 pawn, so that's not a good idea. But so once you reject that, you think, okay, well, the pawns are going off, you might just take immediately. But doing that would favor white, so it helps white's pieces go forward, gets the nicer squares, and so on. So king e7 is very good, with the point that after f takes e6, hey, the king's already pretty well centralized. The white king is making no further progress, so this is pretty good. Now, this is still what I should have played, and then a4, and we'll see why in a moment. Okay, so what I played in the game was a4, and this was a mistake. Well, I mean, a4 is a mistake, not because it's a bad move in its own right. In fact, it's a crucial part, I think, of my plan. But I should have made the pawn exchange first, and we'll see why now. Okay, he played bishop to d4, which is a very good move. I played knight to c4, and now, fortunately, he returned the favor with king to f6. Now, what he should have done here is e takes f5. E takes f5 check. And the reason for this is that it brings my king to the wrong side of the action. So after king takes f5, king to d7, and I really can't bring my king over to the king side. This just won't work. So if, for example, I play king to g5, then I think just bishop to g1 should be good. So bishop g1, and now whether h3 or h4, same thing, bishop to f2. And it doesn't really matter how I play here. Let's say g4, takes, takes, king c6, and the black queenside pawns are ready to roll. So a6 is going to happen, b5, c4, and so on. And my knight will be able to ultimately give itself up for one of them. So there will be a pawn trade probably. So my a pawn and his a pawn will probably be, they'll cancel out. They'll probably be exchanged off. And my knight will be able to get rid of one of these pawns, let's say the b pawn, but there's still going to be one left over. And with my king over on the king side, it's not going to be able to help against it, and the knight won't exist long enough. And so that should decide. While black's bishop will, at some convenient and necessary moment, give itself up for the g4 pawn. So I'm pretty sure this is a fairly easy win for black. Yeah, it would be nice if it was a win for white, but that's not going to happen. So I'd have to play king e4 here, scurry back. But after king to c6, he's made progress. See, with the king on c6, the b pawn is protected, and so now black can play a6 and b5. And see, if we go back to this position here, where I have fe, king e6, and then a4, see, here his king isn't getting to c6 in time. And if you were to play king d7, well, no problem. I play king to d5, and he's still not getting over to c6. Now, you could play king to d6. All right, so it's not quite as bad as all that. But even there, I may be getting more counterplay than I deserve. And also, I can play king d3 with tempo, maybe, and then king c4. And if he plays bishop to d4, I play knight f5 check. Yeah, so actually, let me just show you this instead of filling the board with a zillion arrows here. So king to d3. Okay, if king c6, king c4, and all's well. Well, reasonably well. And if he plays bishop to d4, then I think I can simply play knight f5 check. And if king e5, well, okay, in this case, now I think I have two promising approaches. I can play simply knight to g7, or I can maybe even take on d4. So takes, takes, and then h3. And I'm just going to play g4, and okay, I think white has no real losing chance anymore. So let's say a6. Actually, the only thing we should maybe look at, so a6 is safe, so we can get through this quickly. Here, b5 takes, takes, g5, b4, g6, just in time for white. King f6 takes, takes, king c4 with a draw. But okay, after h3, maybe h5, maybe this could mess this idea up. So g4 takes, takes, and now b5. Although, black can lose too if he gets too clever. So ab, a4, b6, king d6, king d4. Yeah, and black loses. All right, so that's definitely not the way to go. So knight takes d4 is a draw. All right, and if the king goes somewhere else, then I keep checking. And if he goes to e6, I go to e4, no progress there. If he goes to c6, I go to c4, which we already mentioned. Or actually, what am I talking about? I play knight takes d4. So yeah, I'm thinking the other variation. Okay, so king d5 is the other move that we need to discuss. But again, this 2, probably just knight takes d4 and then h3. I should draw. All right, so that's fe6. Okay, so going back to here, yeah, in this position, after king e4, king c6, I don't get there in time. All right, so just to look at two ways that white can try to hold now. So one is to immediately go into the defensive shell over on the queen side. The second is to try for a little bit of kingside counterplay. So let's have a look at each. So we'll start with knight to a3. After a6, king d3, and just trying to defend here as best as possible. The problem is, though, I think that black can simply slowly but surely force the advance of these pawns. All right, now here white can try to go for some counterplay. So we've got again two ways to play: counterplay and passive defense. All right, so passive defense we can knock out pretty quickly and easily. So let's say king c3, king c5, g4, takes, takes, And now this simple little trick with bishop to d4 check. Alright, so if knight takes, then b4, king takes d4. With an easy win, black simply rounds up my g-pawn, and then comes back and wins with the 2 extras. And after bishop to d4, if I retreat, then, okay, bishop to f6 is good, preventing my pawn from advancing further. And, it's just very easy. He plays b4, and bishop to g4 check, and b3, and the pawns just keep moving up. Very easy. Okay, so that's if I play passively. Now, if I go on the counterattack, there's actually one variation that's a little bit close, but I still lose there. So king c5, preparing b4, g4, takes, b4. And we might think for a moment that with both sides having queened, it might be a little bit tough to win, but in fact, the material should be enough for black to win anyway, but there's tactical possibilities that make it even easier. So queen e3, queen f3. Now the king can't go to the g file because of queen to g3 check, and then takes. So king e5, because I can't, also I can't go to e6 because queen to d5 check with a skewer. So king e5, and now bishop to d4, and the skewer happens all the same. Black wins. Alright, so going back here, that's what happened on knight to a3. Now let's suppose we just play h3 straight away so we don't shilly-shally with our kingside counterplay. Well, we'll see that this too doesn't work. So lots of possibilities here. They're all bad. Alright, so king d3. And again, in positions like this, black just advances his pawns, makes sure that I can't sacrifice my knight for both pawns, and then he'll win. So c4, and now again bishop to e3, and it's just easy. Okay, another possibility is knight e5 check, but black can actually just take, and with a little bit of accuracy, black wins. So you might think that white should be okay because both sides queen simultaneously, but while black's king can't prevent white from queening, because king d7, king f6, I can always keep him kind of shouldered out here. But the problem is after king e8, when I play king g7, I've now blocked my passed pawn here, and now I lose the race. So b4, g5, and wins for black. Alright, so that too is a losing move. Alright, next try. Okay, what if I play knight a3? Well, again, b5. So forces the knight away, and now c4, there's no sacrifice. And now king comes up to support the b4 advance. Now we play b3. As a general proposition, by the way, when the pawns are side by side, given that you've got a dark squared bishop, most of the time what you want to do is push the pawn that's going to a light square. Because when the pawns are on the same color square, so if it's both pawns on dark squares or both pawns on light squares, they don't control the opposite color square. So if the pawns are on b3 and c4, they don't control dark squares. If they're on b4 and c3, they don't control light squares. Now, it's not such a problem if they're on light squares because I have a dark squared bishop. But as you can imagine, if you reverse things, if black were to play c3 here, okay, this could be absolutely terrible for him, because after king to b3, he no longer has any pieces that can fight for c4. And the only way he can get to fight for c2 is by bringing his king all the way around. Now, maybe he has enough time for that, although he brings his king to e4. Maybe I play king c2. But you can see, black is making his life much, much, much more difficult in that way. But by b3, there's no difficulty at all, because the bishop on d4 keeps all the dark squares covered. So, king d2, king b4. So again, we have to support the c3 pawn. g4, takes, c3. And black wins without any problem. Okay, and so then finally, one last try. If g4, takes, b5. And now, again, lots of ways to lose. I'll just show one line. Knight to d2, bishop c3, c4, b4, again b3. Bishop goes back to g7, and it's very easy. So b2 is simply winning. Next move. Okay, So this is a lot of fairly long analysis showing that after EF5, King F5, King D7, and then putting the king on C6, black should win. And so that's why I should have played FE6 myself earlier on. But he returned the favor with King F6, takes, and now we kind of have our basic fundamental ending here. Alright, now I played H3, he played bishop to F2, and I played G4. He played H takes G4, I played H takes G4, and now the game is simply a draw, as we'll see in a moment. So I no longer have anything to worry about on the king side, and I'm able to create a blockade on the queen side. You might want at some point to stop the recording and try to figure out exactly how that's going to work from here. But whenever you can choose to do that when you would like, but I want to point out that here H takes G4, the most natural move in the world, is simply a blunder, and that black could have won with the move H4. I mentioned why earlier, which is that with pawns on both sides of the board, at least I think I mentioned this earlier, with pawns on both sides of the board, it's a lot tougher for my knight to be able to handle that. I mean, obviously the knight's a slow moving piece. Its range is fairly short, and so if black can create threats on both sides of the board, I'm going to be out of luck. I simply won't be able to handle it. So, of course, his bishop can't create any threats, and the pawn on h4 can't create any threats, but his king can. So what black wants to do here is to advance the queenside pawns, force my king to go over and defend them, and then swoop with his king over to the king side, win my h-pawn, and win the game in that way. And while I'm not 100% sure that black is winning here, I'm certainly much more confident of the claim that black is winning than that white is drawing. So here's an example. So let's say I play knight to a3 with the same kind of idea I have in the game. a6, knight c4, b5, takes, knight a3, b4, knight c4. Okay, so with this idea, I've blockaded his queenside pawns. I've managed to keep my king right smack dab in the center of the board. So it looks like I'm okay, but I'm probably not. So I think black's best here is bishop to d4, and now I'm in kind of a zugzwang. If I push my g-pawn, I think black will simply reestablish the zugzwang, and I'll end up losing the g-pawn. If I move my king, well, it's a retreat, and his king gets to d5, and then good things start happening to him. And if I move my knight, that's about all that's left. So knight to d2. And now black just has to make a little finesse here. So it looks like the best move here is bishop to g7. Now, if bishop to f6, this shows that black has to be very accurate here. Because if knight c4, b3, king d3, king d5, knight b6 check, king e5 with the idea of king f4, then knight to d7, and I hold. I'm able to draw the position because he's got to retreat with his king. Then knight takes c5. So bishop to g7 here is right, getting out of the way of that trick. Knight c4, b3, king d3, king d5, and again, white's in zugzwang here. Pushing the g-pawn doesn't help. I mean, I can do that, and black can just play bishop h8, g7, until I run out of moves with the g-pawn. And what can I do? I can't move my king because it would drop the knight. If I move my knight someplace where it's not with check, then I'm just allowing b2, and then I have to retreat even more. And furthermore, if I do make a knight check, like knight to b6, well, now king to e5, and his king is ready to seep in over here and go after and win my h-pawn when the position will be just completely hopeless for me. So, for example, knight to d7, king f4, knight c5, b2. Okay, and now if knight e6 check, simplest is just king to e5 with a winning double attack. So hitting the knight and threatening queen. Okay, so king c2 is clearly forced. King g3, knight e6, bishop to e5. And now, okay, if I play knight f8, I'm just losing here. And this again illustrates the power of a bishop to be able to perform tasks on both sides of the board. So the bishop protects the b2 pawn while simultaneously stopping my g pawn dead in its tracks. So I lose there. And similarly, okay, if I play g5, g6, g7, well, now I get rid of that bishop at last, but I have no defense against his pass pawn, his h pawn. So obviously a variation like this is impossible if we've traded off all the kingside pawns, which is what happened in the game, and which is why I was able to draw. So bear this in mind, those of you who are toiling away with the bishop against the knight, that having pawns on both sides of the board, if you're trying to win, is generally going to be to your advantage. So h takes g4 happened, hg, bishop h4, and now I draw with the idea that I had long ago prepared. Knight a3, threatening knight to b5, with the point that, okay, well, he plays a6, I play knight c7 check, but even if it's not check, it forces the pawn to a5. And if he has pawns on a5, b6, and c4, it's clear that all I have to do is put my king someplace where it's covering the c4 square, and best of all would be to just have my king on the c4 square, and then he can never, ever, ever displace me. So it's just a dead draw. So black rightly plays a6 here, keeping my knight from going to b5, where it will eventually force a5, or most likely force a5. Okay, now I play knight to c4. And at first glance, this seems kind of crazy. I'm encouraging his pawns to come forward. But the key point, the essential factor here, is that I'm forcing his pawns to come forward before his king is really ready to help them out. So they're in effect going to be overextended. So b5 is forced. I take, he takes. I play knight a3, again drawing the pawn forward. If black could play king to c6 here, I would be losing. So simple as that. King c6, and I believe that the position is just a win for black. But here he's got to play b4. And now I play knight c4. And already the game is a draw. Bishop f6, king d3, king d5. But now I'm able to make it perfect here. So knight to e3 check, king e5, king c4. Plays bishop e7, protecting the c5 pawn. King to b3, and knight to c4. And this is just a dead draw. And this, of course, highlights why I was mentioning, why I said before, that when you're advancing the pawns, you always want to advance them whenever possible to squares opposite the color of your bishop. Because here, black has no pieces that can overcome my control over the light squares. The pawns can't, the bishop can't, and the king can, but it's outnumbered 2-1. So the only thing that black has left to try is Zugzwang, and we'll see he's not able to do so. So let's move along here. King f4, knight a5, knight c4, knight a5. Okay. Now let's think about this position. Okay, well, my knight's on c4, so let's look at this position here. We can try to figure out what exactly it is that black should try to do. And the key thing is, the only way he can win is by either forcing my knight to move to a light square other than c4, or by forcing my king to leave b3. Now, the only way he can force my king to move is if he can force my knight to not be able to move. If he can create a situation such that anywhere my knight goes, it would be lost. Well, to do that, he's got to cover every single dark square they can move to now. So that's a3, a5, b6, d6, e5, e3, d2, and b2. Now, a3 and c3, oh sorry, not c3, it's irrelevant. a3 is already covered by the pawn, so that's no problem. Alright, a5, b6, d6, and e5 are all covered by the bishop. The king covers e3, and it can cover d2 as well by going to d3. So if we put the king on d3, let me use a different color arrow here. If we put the king on d3, then all but one square are covered. But unfortunately, there's no way for black to manipulate his pieces where all 8 of these squares can be covered. So he can come within one square a couple of different ways. So this is one way with his king on d3. And the other way is, I think, by putting his bishop on c1. So if the bishop is on, whoops, if the bishop's on c1, what am I doing here? I forgot how to get the right color that I wanted. Okay. Very strange. Alright, well, I'll stop playing with colors now. I'll just make yellow. You can put the bishop on c1, that covers a3, b2, d2, and e3. And put the king on where? Yeah, no, okay, that won't even cover as many squares. So you can put the king on b5, but then I'll have d6 and e5. So there simply isn't any way for him to cover. Okay, yeah, that's right. Now I remember what it was. Okay, not on c1, but on f4. Hey, there we go. No problem that time. Why couldn't I do it here? There we go. Okay, I'll stop amusing myself with pretty colors now. If I put the bishop, or if black puts the bishop on f1 and puts his king on b5, then that too would cover 7 of the squares. But then I would still have b2 left over. So there's no way for him to cover all 8 squares, and if you can't do it, then I always have a way to hold. And of course, I made sure about this before I went down this line, and it's fortunate. But it really does highlight just how bad bishops can be in their worst settings. So the game went a few more moves: knight b2, knight c4, and knight c4 again, and he finally accepted the draw here. So a narrow escape, and yes, you can see black can play bishop to f4 here, so we can go one more move. Oops. Bishop f4, and it covers 7 of the squares, but I still have knight to b2, and that's enough. So narrow escape, as I said, but one that again shows the power of a knight. It presents this blockading idea, which is a very, very important one. Really, it's the only thing that I can try. I mean, when you're down 2 pawns, especially, I mean, there really aren't any other options. There's either the blockade or exchanging the knight for the 2 pawns. And if the opponent does it right, that should never happen. But as we see, I mean, here it just took his king being 1 square too far away for this to happen. So I think there are a few valuable lessons to be learned from this. So one is what we're just talking about here, this blockade. The second is this very important idea of pawns on both sides of the board, definitely favoring the side with the bishop. Conversely, it's a lot easier for the knight to defend if everything is just on one side of the board. So I think that's most of what you ought to know about this example. I think to some extent just the picture of my knight going back and forth here to and from c4 speaks louder than a lot of words will. So I hope you learned something, and maybe next week we'll have a look at the bishop faring better than the knight. Also, an idea that we're considering, myself and the chessvideos.tv powers that be, is of maybe having you guys submit games to me, and I'm not sure how often it'll be, and how long we'll try it, but it's definitely thinking about this, of letting you guys submit games, and I'll maybe cover the best one, maybe best two, depending on how long it'll take, in a given show. Maybe we'll do this for a few weeks in a row. Maybe we'll do it once every month. Don't know, but it's a possibility. So maybe you can give some feedback on that, either in the comment section to this video, or maybe you can just talk to Josh Specht, the admin. However you want to do it, but it would probably be a good thing. So, and also, while I'm plugging things, I'll mention my blog, so take a look at that, chessmind.powerblogs.com. Just finished lots and lots of coverage of the Grand Slam final in Bilbao, and of course we'll have tons of coverage of the World Championship in October, but there will always be stuff even between now and then, depending on interest and what's going on in the chess world, and I think you'll find it interesting. So take a look at that, chessmind.powerblogs.com. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.